Thank you, Randa. We'll try to keep this brief and take a look into the future based on the current pipeline of LDCs that are in the graduation process and try to imagine what the LDC group will look like in the near to medium future, and then try to draw some conclusions based on that, on what the shape and form of international support mechanisms for LDCs has to look like to address the challenges of the remaining countries. Now, why is this important? We have heard a little bit about that already in the first presentation. There is very uneven progress among the current LDCs. There are some LDCs that are progressing towards graduation and some LDCs that are graduating. But for others, and these others represent the majority of LDCs, graduation remains elusive and distant. And this is because there are structural vulnerabilities in these countries that are very persistent, and as a consequence of that, the support needs for these countries are long-term. We heard this already. 8 countries have graduated from LDC status so far. Those are not many, seeing as graduation as a concept goes back to the early 1990s. However, there are, of the 44 LDCs that remain in the category, 17 that have reached at least one of the milestones on the graduation path. As you know, the graduation path is a multi-year process that consists essentially of reaching a number of milestones, the first being to be found pre-eligible for graduation in one of the triennial reviews of the CDP. Second milestone would be to be again found eligible for graduation in a consecutive triennial review of the CDP. The third milestone would be to actually be recommended for graduation by the CDP, and the fourth milestone would be then to have the General Assembly issue a resolution that sets a graduation date and the length of a preparatory period. And the process can be delayed or derailed at any point in time during this process. But the current landscape looks like this. We have 6 countries that have a graduation date set, 3 of them for 2026. And we've just heard from Wolf that Bangladesh is potentially having second thoughts. But the current state of affairs is that it will graduate at the end of 2026. We have the Solomon Islands that will graduate in 2027. And then we have 2 more countries that will graduate thereafter. Then we have a number of countries that have been recommended for graduation by the CDP, but the ECOSOC has not yet decided on this recommendation. We have countries that have met the graduation criteria in 2 or even 3 consecutive triennial reviews, but the CDP has not yet taken a decision on a recommendation. And we have 3 countries that are new to the pipeline, namely Rwanda, Uganda, and the United Republic of Tanzania, which are 3 countries that met the graduation criteria for the first time in 2024, so they will be reconsidered in 2027, meaning that if they reach them again, they will normally be recommended by the CDP for graduation. And then we have 3 special cases, you could call them. Rolf has gone through some of those cases already. We have Angola that had a graduation date already set, so that a country that had reached all of the milestones, but then the graduation was deferred and now it no longer meets the criteria. We have Timor-Leste that had actually met the criteria 3 times in the past, but it does not meet the criteria anymore, according to the latest review, and no decision had been taken on graduation before that. And then we have Zambia that had met the graduation criteria once in 2021, but did not meet the criteria again in the consecutive or the next review in 2024. But by and large, you could call all these 17 countries as countries that in some way or other are in the pipeline of graduation. So in the following, I will call these the pipeline countries, and all the remaining 27 countries, the non-pipeline countries. Just to be very clear, this is not a formal or official designation of country groups. This is just done for illustrative purposes for this presentation. Now, if we take the 17 countries out of the 44, we are left with 27 LDCs that have not yet reached any of the graduation milestones. The vast majority of these 27 countries, namely 24, are in Africa. We have 2, namely Afghanistan and Yemen in Asia, and then we have, of course, Haiti in the Caribbean. So these are the 27 countries that we would call the non-pipeline countries. And if you look at these countries, these 2 country groups, the ones in the pipeline and the ones not yet in the pipeline, and look at these groups through various metrics and through various lenses, we will see that there are very critical areas in which there is a divergence between those country groups. I will start with the actual LDC criteria. First is the Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index. It's again, there are 3 criteria, and we will look at each of them. The difference in the averages of economic and environmental vulnerability between the pipeline and non-pipeline LDCs is substantial. This is an indicator where you want to have low values because it measures vulnerability, so the lower this value is, the better for the country. If you look at the individual countries, again, on the right-hand side, you have countries with low vulnerability values, and on the left-hand side, you have very vulnerable countries. We see a rather mixed picture, actually. We see that we have the majority of countries in the pipeline, which are the blue countries, are on the right-hand side, but we also have a few blue countries in the middle and even on the left of the distribution of countries. And this is the first conclusion we can draw. Vulnerability is a persistent issue that does not disappear magically through graduation. You have countries that really manage to bring down vulnerability, but you have other countries that are sometimes quite advanced on the graduation path, but are still considered highly vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks. This means, and this underlines the importance of continuing support for countries during the graduation process, but also beyond that. And the mandate of UNCTAD in this respect has recently been strengthened by the outcome of UNCTAD 16, the so-called Geneva Consensus. Now the picture becomes a bit more clearer if you look at human assets. Human assets are, of course, a very fundamental ingredient and enabler of economic development in any developing country. Here we see a very significant difference in the averages between countries in the pipeline on the left and the average of countries that are not in the pipeline on the right. And this distribution is very clear if we look at the individual countries, with one exception being Angola. All of the countries within the pipeline, again the blue countries, are on the right-hand side of the distribution, and countries on the left-hand side of the distribution have lower human assets. So human assets index is, of course, something where you want to have higher values. You want to have more and stronger human assets. And particularly worrisome is that we have on the left-hand side of the distribution a number of countries where the distance from their current values to the graduation threshold, which is shown by the red line in this graph, is very, very large. So here it is very clear that it will take considerable time and efforts in order to bridge that gap and reach the graduation threshold sometime in the future. The third criterion is GNI per capita, of course, a very fundamental indicator when it comes to poverty reduction, to economic growth and development. Again, we see a very clear picture in terms of the differences in the averages between the pipeline LDCs and the non-pipeline LDCs, almost a factor of 3. And similarly, if you look at the country-by-country distribution, we find the blue countries, the countries in the pipeline towards the right, having larger values of GNI per capita. And again, countries on the left-hand side in many cases with a very, very substantial gap to the graduation threshold, which, just as a reminder, is not a value. If you reach that, a rich country or anything like that is just the threshold to reach to cease to be a low-income country. And we see that a large number of the non-pipeline countries have a significant gap to bridge. And there are also a few countries that are currently in the graduation pipeline that have not reached this criterion as well. If we look at not the current state of affairs, but the past decades, how these two country groups have fared in terms of per capita growth, we again see that the pipeline countries have had growth that is not only stronger, but also more resilient. And this, first of all, their average growth rate has been higher in every year in the past decade. But also if you look at, for instance, the year 2020, which is the year where the COVID-19 pandemic caused a sharp decline in global output, we see that this decline is much more pronounced in the countries that are not in the pipeline. And if you look at 2021, the year of the rebound, we see a very substantial rebound in the countries that are in the pipeline, but a continuation of a recession on average in the countries that are not in the pipeline, meaning that these countries are really much more vulnerable to shocks and volatility of the global economy. And as a consequence of that, we see average incomes per capita diverge between the two country groups. We see a very flat curve for the non-pipeline countries on average, and a healthy growth for the pipeline countries. And at the beginning of the period here in 1995, if you compare that gap with the gap in 2024, you see that this gap has enlarged very significantly, meaning that we have a very large-scale divergence between these two country groups. Another measure we can look at is labor productivity. Labor productivity is a very important metric. It's very closely related to, of course, income per capita, to real wages. It's a measure of structural transformation in a sense. Without structural transformation, it's almost impossible to grow labor productivity. Here we see very slow progress in both country groups, but still a widening gap between pipeline and non-pipeline LDCs, particularly in the past 5 years. And one of the underlying factors behind those trends that we have just seen is that non-pipeline LDCs have across the board weaker productive capacities. This is the latest edition of the Productive Capacities Index of UNCTAD. On the left-hand side, we have the overall index, followed by all its individual sub-indicators, and there's only the natural capital sub-indicator where we find that the non-pipeline countries have a stronger value. In all the other ones, particularly in those crucial ones around infrastructure such as energy, transport, ICT, we find that the productive capacities are much stronger in the countries that are currently in the pipeline to graduate from LDC status. And if you look at the individual countries, these pictures, again, just by looking at it, you can see that the blue countries are on the right, the yellow countries are more on the left, meaning that we have a clear separation between the two groups of countries. And again, the gap between the strongest countries here within the LDC group and the weakest countries is alarmingly big. And if you look at this time trend over time, again, we find that the gap is widening. So the underlying factor between the widening gap in GDP per capita and productivity is, of course, a widening gap in terms of productive capacities between the two country groups. Another common feature of all LDCs is that the majority of them depends to a large extent on commodity exports for their export revenue. Now, those are the two averages for the pipeline and non-pipeline countries. UNCTAD considers a country as commodity dependent if it derives more than 60% of its merchandise export value from primary commodities. This means that even the countries within the pipeline are on average commodity dependent. However, commodity dependence is much more deeply entrenched in the non-pipeline LDCs, and commodity dependence as a large body of work, including produced by UNCTAD, has shown is related to a number of negative outcomes. It's a development obstacle that's related to income volatility, to slow productivity growth, low human development, Dutch disease, macroeconomic turmoil, and so on and so forth. So therefore, structural transformation, diversification is really crucial, and here the pipeline countries have clearly made more progress than the non-pipeline countries. Still, then remains a path ahead even for the countries that are currently in the pipeline. Here again, similar picture. Here you want to be rather on the left-hand side, but let's not forget we have here countries in blue that are in the middle and somewhat on the right-hand side of the distribution. This means that the classification as commodity dependent remains an issue for many countries within the graduation pipeline and remains a source of risk, uncertainty, and volatility, even for countries that have made significant progress on their development and graduation pathways. Just a few other more indicators to show the underlying factors between the divergence between the two country groups. Here we have the average rate of access to electricity. Pipeline countries have made very large progress over the past decades. Non-pipeline countries also have made progress, but it has been slower, and the road ahead to reaching SDG 7 of sustainable energy for all really remains very long. This is a very fundamental indicator. It is impossible to imagine any form of modern industrial operation or services sector in the absence of access to electricity. It's closely related to education outcomes and, of course, to the quality of public services as well. Again, here we see a very clear picture. With few exceptions, the pipeline countries are on the right-hand side of the distribution, some having reached universal access to electricity, and again, very worrisome figure for some of the countries on the left-hand side of the distribution. And this is the final indicator that we look at is agricultural productivity. This is also not randomly chosen. We've seen that structural transformation, which is a necessary condition for growth and development in the LDCs, is for structural transformation to happen, a boost in agricultural productivity is absolutely necessary. And we see here again a very large gap between the average productivity here as an example, the cereal yields per hectare in pipeline countries versus non-pipeline countries. And again, unless the agricultural sector is modernized and really experiences this boost in productivity that is necessary, structural transformation will be very, very difficult, but also this is of course a risk when it comes to food security and other fundamental development challenges. And again, the country distribution here, again, a very clear picture with the sole exception of Angola, which, as we have heard, is a special case in terms of the pipeline countries, and some would argue is no longer in the pipeline. All the other countries that are in the pipeline are on the right-hand side of the distribution. So now, if we try to draw some conclusions from that, first of all, it is clear that there are structural challenges that persist not only, but specifically among the 27 countries that are not currently in the graduation pipeline. Some common features, 11 of these 27 are also LLDCs, landlocked developing countries, which means that they face the additional challenges that come with being landlocked. Currently, there are 11 out of these 27 countries that are classified as being at high risk for debt distress by the IMF, and 2 additional countries out of these 27 are currently in debt distress. We have 17 out of the 27 countries that are on the World Bank's list of fragile and conflict-affected situations. 13 are classified as fragile and 3 as conflict-affected. We have 24 countries that are classified as having low human development according to the latest Human Development Index. Those are 24 out of only 27 countries in the world that are classified as having low human development. So the list of non-pipeline LDCs and the list of countries with low human development are almost identical. and the remaining 3 countries are at the very bottom of the list of countries with medium human development. So again, all of these are just numbers that show, and features that show that these 27 countries that have not reached any of the graduation milestones will very likely need reinforced long-term support to ensure that they also make additional progress and are able to catch up with the other countries. So a few key questions that all of this entail. First of all, we need to think about how can it be avoided that the non-pipeline LDCs are left further behind, because we see diverging trends across the board almost of development indicators. So we need to ensure that these countries are not left behind and these countries don't fall further behind. So how can this be achieved? So how can international support measures address persistent structural weaknesses? We have seen structural weaknesses across the board in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the composition of the economy, in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of labor productivity. So these are all very persistent features of these countries, and we need to devise international support measures that can really address these and boost growth in these countries. And of course, many of these countries have overlapping challenges. For instance, fragility plus commodity dependence plus debt distress. So how to deal with these situations in the framework of international support measures for LDCs. And then, of course, we need to think about what happens if the non-pipeline, this should read non-pipeline LDCs, are becoming a permanent group. Do we want this? Is this something that is a realistic scenario? And what does it mean for the current framework of international support measures that we have in place? And with this, I hope this was some food for thought and some questions to think about. These are actual questions. We don't have the answers for all of these, but we hope this was informative. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and hand it back to Randa.